So originally, just to state, like, the idea of a design guide is not that original. Like, the tech realm, interaction UX is starting to eat it up. A lot of different orgs are doing it. It's existed for hundreds of years in many ways. Like, if you look towards architecture, it had pattern library books for a very, very long time. I had a brief period in my education where I was architecture before jumping into UX, and I bought this architectural graphic standards book. And the idea is there's a lot of things you don't need to reinvent. Like, you've already laid out what is the basic width of the human being, how do our door frames look. You can make the rest of your building being very like amorphous, something that looks like something Zaha Hadid or Gary designed, but you're still going to want to have your doorways be set to a certain pattern type. And this is the idea that architecture really laid that foundation out. Within software, that idea kind of started to get carried over. I don't know too much, because this book was more directed towards software engineering types, but in the earlier ages of programming, when applications were getting built, people started to lay out those generalized patterns, not necessarily the UX, visual, aesthetic, experiential side, but just purely, I'm doing a search query. What are the steps that you're going to program into this interface that you're going to go through? And this same search query is going to be the same as your search query anywhere else in your application. Now, something that's probably a little bit more accurate to look towards in relation to what we're laying out is things such as graphic standards manuals. A lot of print companies, like any older design agency, or any branding section of a company will often have this sort of thing. Here specifically, I'm showing off the NASA graphic standards manual. And this was something that had like a fun Kickstarter a year ago. You could buy it. And the idea is that these sort of books start to lay out what is the branding, the imagery. I'm trying to make a new pamphlet for something that we're marketing. Well, what font choices do I have? What font sizing do I use? What are the colors that define NASA, when this book came out at least? What is our logo? How do we use it? But also starting to get into actual usage, like when I'm laying out a pamphlet, what is a layout that screams NASA versus what is a layout that if we did this, it would look drastically different and wouldn't really fit with the rest of the aesthetic. And also here, for example, how do I lay out the logo on the side of a spacecraft? Now, the metaphor I'd say here is, what is your company's spacecraft? What is your specific way in which maybe you're using branding or imagery or logo type in a unique and different way that is different from how another company might be using their sort of imagery? Now, a slightly more interaction UX classic realm that you probably heard of this in is the HIG, the Human Interface Guidelines that Apple lays out. And this is a good set of guidelines that got drilled into me 4 years ago during an internship. Like, if I'm making an application that looks like Apple, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What is the core philosophy of what makes this application? And here, theirs isn't so much, they don't necessarily lay out specific colors or specific font types. You can get access to them, but the HIG is much more, what is the feeling of this? What is our layout aesthetic? What is that white space feeling? When we are doing motions, are they jagged, are they jarring, or are they smooth and human-like? And while you can look towards the Apple's HIG as a very aesthetically pleasing, a very modern feeling one, almost any application you're working on could probably use something in this realm. This is one I grabbed that was from, I hadn't heard of it before, but Microsoft apparently makes health applications. And I found this sort of design guide that they had created, in which it's not quite as aesthetically pleasing, but it's doing that same thing. What is this reoccurring pattern that we're using within these health applications? How do we reuse it over and over again? And how do we lay it out so if I have two different designers on opposing sides of the world, they're not sitting there spending 20 hours this week rethinking an idea that had already been thought out by someone else. Another good example is like with Windows 8, and this starts getting into when you're building that design guide, are you approaching any sort of concept that is unique to your realm? So like with Windows 8, it was like one of the first places that there was like a touchscreen interface, and how do cards work there? How do they react differently when a lot of your interface realm is primarily touch, as opposed to when you were designing something that was more for a mouse environment? Are there any specific instances when you're thinking through your product that are unique to your problem case scenario? And this one I'm going to show in a few examples because it's probably the most famous currently, is Google's Material Design Guide. Same sort of idea. They lay out the fonts, their colors, their motions, and once again, they get to the core philosophy of things. One of the things I specifically like about them is they actually get into a set of coded components in which, along with the Google Material Guide, in which they explain, why did we make this motion choice? Why did we make this color choice? What are all the hex values that go with it? They also lay out some of the basics. So say you're a developer and you're trying to make a prototype quickly and easily, they already have an example of here's that plus button in the bottom that's like Google's active button, and you can actually throw it into your application quickly and easily. So you can go back to their guide to read and understand why was this designed that way in the first place, why does it have that hover effect, why does it have that focus effect. But then if you're actually just trying to make a quick and dirty prototype that looks like the Google aesthetic, you can grab this set of framework libraries to use. And I want to actually show that one off. We're going to have to
drag that over.
Oh yeah, so this is that one example. And a good reason it exists is because not only can you show off your reasoning, but now you're showing off things such as when you click, you get that little burst explosion. And if you just did a static design guide, that wouldn't come across in the same way. If you even just did an interactive prototype, you might not be thinking of all those states. But the second you start jumping into that coded prototype realm within your greater design guide as a whole, you're going to start thinking through all those interaction patterns and making sure they're in your final product. Okay. Now, some of the things, like what I've been trying to show off is sort of a spectrum. On one end, you have like the NASA's Graphic Standards Manual, and that's more directed at prints, static realms. It's very visual. It's purely graphical. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things like Bootstrap, where they also, in a way, are a design guide. They're showing off, here's the way our buttons work, here's the way our tables work, but they don't explain why they made those choices. It's just a quick and dirty thing you can grab and make a prototype or make your entire product out of, but you don't necessarily know why did they do that specific 40 pixel spacing on their tables or why their buttons do a specific effect. You're probably assuming that they did some sort of reasoning behind it, but you don't actually know. Okay. And now I'm going to get into what led into specifically the analytics platform design guide. So first off, when I first started at IBM 4 years ago, we didn't have anything. They had just started the design movement there. And I was in that first set of 60 design hires where we were thinking, oh, we need to have a look and feel and what does IBM look like as opposed to other companies. So in that, different teams were making different products, laying out prototypes and things of that nature, and starting to lay out the same set of components, yeah. So things such as, what is the color? What is the color of IBM? Here's a set of blues that look like an IBM product in general. Here's a set of oranges. Here's a set of yellows. When we're using icons, what are the icons that look like an IBM product as opposed to an Apple product or a Google product? Along with the beginning of making basic prototypes that showed, okay, even this is fake information. What is the grander look and feel going to be of IBM products? But the idea behind that language was it was meant to be very open-ended. IBM had the very unique case scenario in which it wasn't just one team. It was like 30 different teams. So from that grander design language where things were very open-ended and broad, each of these different teams then had much more specific subsets. The Analytics platform has a design guide. Watson is a design guide. Bluemix is a design guide. And while they all pull from that grander language, they all are much more specific towards their unique use case scenarios. Okay. And this is the navigation page, and I'm going to try to do a better screen share when we show it live. But this is our guide. Ours pulled from that grander IBM design language, and once again, we did that. We figured out what's a smaller subset of colors. We had to use Helvetica New, but what sizing of Helvetica New are we using? What font weights are we using? And when we get into the interactions of the buttons and the components, how are they unique and different? And this is not an optimal. That's sized weird.
Aww.
So once again, it's the same idea where you can start to see within it. We're going to talk through the meaning behind like what went into these, but we have things such as of the IBM design language colors. Is it going to load? Yeah. Okay. What is a subset that defines an analytics platform application within that broader construct? Or when we're looking at things like each of the different components that you might start to use, each of the broader interactions. Oh, buttons, yeah. I mean, classic, every single application that you're ever going to design is going to have a million different button types. The guide made it very nice because we could start to think through, and I'm a big fan of the code section, what is the hover state, what is the interaction state? And it became a central resource that not only could the visual designers, the UX designers, and the researchers all look towards to understand get files of what was working and what wasn't working, or start building their own prototypes, but also the coders could look towards to get the basic beginning when they are working on it. Yeah, so each of the different components within our guide explains spacing for slightly different components that are almost nearly the same. Like you have buttons with icons next to them. Along with also explaining, a big part of our application set was the fact that there was both a light and dark version of everything. And not only was that unique in the sense of we wanted to make sure that visually when people laid things out, it was set that way, we also wanted to make it clear that through the code, that difference was actually very minimal. Like here, when we show the coded components, all that's changing is one class, and it's showing to our developers, you're not doing that much. Everything else is staying the same. You're just changing a few of the visual aspects. Okay. Now, Voranouth is going to talk a little bit more about the process that went into that guide and what steps we worked through getting to it.
All right, so to get to where we are, we had to go through the process, which is the design process, of course, and I'm going to walk you through where we started and how we built upward from that foundation. So the first thing we started with was branding. Branding, we needed to figure out like who we are and what's going to make our products stand out. Branding is really important because it paves the way for everything else that comes after it. And for us, we had two different audiences, or same, whatever you want to think. One was a designer and one was a developer. And both are coming to our website to use our tools and to build products for their own set of users, and which include a business analyst, a data scientist, and a data engineer. And after a few workshops, we developed 6 core tenets that would embody the brand of analytics platform. Our brand should promote human-to-human experiences. Our data and analysis should be transparent and trusted. We want our users and their users to be confident while making their decisions and to be empowered to act upon these insights that they've gained from the data. Our brand philosophy was the first puzzle piece in creating a design guide. The next puzzle piece is figuring out what we look like. After we've decided our portfolio's why, we were able to connect 4 foundations of visual design to it. One of the most difficult decisions was in choosing colors. And as you can see, our products are clearly not blue, as one might expect from IBM. We needed to stand out more. We had everyone on our team be a part of the research, the workshops, this color mapping, and the decision-making process. Here you can see one of our exercises, where we mapped out colors based on emotional to functional on the y-axis and approachable to powerful on the x-axis. We also had our product teams map out where exactly they saw their products on the same spectrum so that we can compare before choosing colors. I've also researched some of our competitors to get a feel of what our product user might see when they're opening up their software, just so we can get a feel for, what we could do or to fit in. As you can see, the UI colors are pretty muted and most of the software was light. For the primary colors, most of the time it was either blue or teal. And if there was any warm colors at all, it would be orange for some reason. One does not simply ignore accessibility. This is something that I feel very strongly about. While choosing colors, we baked in accessibility for color blindness and for color contrast. This is really important because, especially at IBM, because we want to be inclusive to everyone. It's actually a lot harder than you think it is, and it should be baked in at the very beginning and not left only as a developer's responsibility. Accessibility has made a lot of great decisions for our team, and it's going to continue to be a part of our process.
Here I'm going to show off a little bit of that, just once again, looking at buttons and then sliders. It's the sort of thing like when we are making choices, the font sizing. We won't let the developers try, we'll get feedback, we want everything on the screen tighter and we need to put much more information on the screen. Well, no, there's a certain set negative space that you need to have, and you can't have the font below a certain size, because if you reduce the font too low, it's bad for people of varying levels on the visual loss spectrum. The color choices. We muted grays are fun, and Apple does these interesting things with opacity, but if it gets below a certain contrast level, it's not going to be readable by everything and everyone. And while it's maybe visually pleasing, it's not accessible anymore. And even little things like we throw in these hover effects or the click effects, and they're nice, but they actually already are also thinking of accessibility issues. You want to make sure that the user has an understanding of where they're at on the screen, if something actually happened, if their action with a keyboard interacted with it. And even, I'm going to go to sliders too, because that was a more complex one. That slider, yeah. Like here, for example, when we first laid out sliders, yes. When we first laid out sliders, they were actually fairly simple. They were just a slider back and forth with a number at the end. But then we realized that with screen readers, they needed something that when they were tabbing through the page, they could jump to the high and the low. And also with the number itself, while you were interacting with your mouse, you also want to make it so that when they're typing with the keyboard, it implements, like it has keyboard interactivity along with the visual mouse interactivity. And each of the, like we're still working on some of the components to get them fully accessible, but every single component we try to think through of, if I cannot interact with this with my mouse, can I still interact with the keyboard? If I am interacting with the keyboard, what are the new highlight, focus, etc. states to make sure it's visually understandable that some sort of interaction is occurring?
All right, so also when choosing grids and typography, we had to make sure that it's responsive, of course, but we also had to make sure that the type also scaled while you were being responsive. We realized that the way visual designers comprehend grids is completely different from how a developer or a front-end developer might comprehend a grid, or at least I did. I knew this, and sometimes you're just going to have to sit down and explain your end of the spectrum to get a mutual understanding. After laying down the foundations for visual design, we designed UI components. We looked at what all of our teams were currently using, and many of them were still at the beginning stages 2 years ago. Some of them had wireframes, so it left it really open-ended for us, which is super fun. We started with basic components such as a button, or in this instance, you can see a number input. I pretty much went to every team and asked them how they were using this component that I'm researching, see if they had any instances of it. Some teams did, some teams didn't, some teams used it completely different than other teams. So this was all very important for my team to be able to tell the story of why we designed this component the way we did. And after that, we just had a lot of explorations, a ton of explorations. Not just by me, but also by the few other designers on my team. During this time, user experience and visual design intertwined. We had to think of the different states that this particular component might have and where in the UI this component might live. And after exploring, we had to come back down to earth, and we may code up some explorations, but we always showed off our concepts to our teams and to unanimously make a decision. After creating the UI components, we figured out interactive patterns such as a basic search bar, spreadsheets, or cards that could be repeated throughout our entire portfolio. First, we had to figure out what our user journey was. What was the intention of our user? What are our users trying to accomplish? We always try to expand the user journey by thinking of these special use case scenarios that would break the flow. However, you have to keep in mind that since you're designing a general guide, that you're not trying to solve everyone's problems or specific use cases, just the ones that can be repeated throughout the entire portfolio for every product. Finally, the interactions and explorations come to life, especially when it's animated or coding and working. Design is always a very iterative process, and we don't know how many times we're going to have to explore to get it right where we want it, where it feels just right, or where we've answered enough questions for this to be live on the guide. As a visual designer, we try our best to answer all of these questions, but it's not until we code the component and see it working that we're able to explore outside of these static designs and visualize the cadence of the interactions.
And to say with that previous graphic also, like one of the big things that they do one of the big things that they kind of push at IBM Design was the idea that it's not even just a loop, but it is a reoccurring infinite loop where something you designed once might come back into play when you're working on a different application. You solve this scenario one time, you might have something nearly the same another time. So never throwing stuff out, keeping it organized, even if you have an entire, I worked on a product that spent like 3 or 4 months working on it, had a final great prototype, and then it died. But ideas that worked into it ended up living on within actually this guide itself. Here, for example, though, I'm also specifically showing off some of that iterative process. And this is kind of where like that iteration within design isn't just on the visual side, but can also be played out through your front-end developers. Here, Voranouth laid out these really nice table views of information. We were laying out cards everywhere, but a lot of our users still gave feedback that they wanted a list view of that same information. Well, here we were trying to think through the specific micro-interactions of when I'm hovering on that list view, what's happening. So you can see those little, on the left side, there's different hover states, the way that line is appearing into it. And those are getting into specific weeds of these components, but they are those like pleasant little micro interactions that make it an enjoyable experience as opposed to just a, great, I got through my mundane application today. And the nice thing is also because we could have just done this exploration through animation. For one, I knew enough code to do this really quickly. Like I could make 20 different versions of this in an evening because it was just small interactions to the CSS changes. And also we discovered which ones would work for developers easier or better. So to make this table list view, if we wanted to do a sorting mechanism, we probably would have had to use an existing library. Some of those libraries didn't support certain visual ideas that we were proposing. So by making that coded component, we discovered that, and hopefully we're making our developers' lives later on not quite as hellish. And this is another good example of one. Through coding the sliders, we discovered issues with them. When we first laid them out, they looked much more like the ones on the left, where there wasn't much going on. I don't even think we had numbers at first. Then we realized that we need to have a number along with the slider to show what that number is, not just for user experience, but also for accessibility. If you didn't have that number, someone using a screen reader has no idea where you're at, potentially, unless you specifically are coding it up right. Eventually, we realized the ones on the right, where it showed both the low range, the high range, the number in the middle, and also thinking through sometimes you want to hide that number, sometimes you'd want to show that number, and also thinking through how that would interact with mouse input. Now this one I'm just showing is a good metaphor for this entire process. I'm grabbing it from patternlab.io, but that's what we did. We thought through the specific atoms, and those are things like buttons, number inputs, word inputs, but those combine into more complex interactions. So the molecule might be something akin to a search, where you not only have an icon going on, but you could have a drop down, you could have autocomplete, you could have different text things going on. Those combine into more complex patterns. So like we have a navigation page within our guide, and that's composed of a set of buttons, a drop down, and then some links within it. And we didn't quite get to the templates or pages within the guide yet, but that's something that we would be working towards as our applications got more and more complex. Okay.
Cool. So now we could talk about the style guide and the assets, which include the visual guide, the UI component, and the interaction guides. They were all important puzzle pieces used to build our style guide. We have a lot of information that we want to share geared towards designers and developers, but we also had to keep in mind that some of our development teams didn't even have designers on their team. So we had to make sure that this guide was able to be comprehended by all. Here again, we go through the design process. You can see here we have the basic wireframes where we're focusing on our content first. Here is the first release of our guide. As you can see, we didn't have very much content, and we quickly realized that this was not able to support what it would grow to become, and it wasn't going to be a pleasant experience at all. We changed the navigation a few times, and content was a huge factor why we made these decisions.
And specifically here, this was something at this point in time, we were coding it alongside it. It wasn't just static screens that we were laying out in front of people, but this was something that we actually had a coded site, and we were able to see, oh, this looks wonderful on a 30-inch Mac monitor, but doesn't look so great when we put it onto an iPad, or doesn't look so great when even on a normal laptop, but it's like one of the MacBook Airs that doesn't have quite as much space. And we were able to, that's when we started making decisions, like you see that little hamburger in the top right and the right one. We realized, oh, if we want to have more space for the content, then we need to hide our menu as much as we hate hamburgers.
Okay, this is the most recent version, as you guys saw, of our site's navigation. Once again, showing that iteration concept and how we continue to change how our guide's being used based on our user feedback. Our guide also has downloadable assets that are also organized precisely. I don't have a photo of this up there, but I wanted to mention that our filing and folder naming system is extremely organized so that our developers and designers both can kind of like speak the same language. So if you're looking for a file, you know exactly where to look for that file. Also within the design assets, for instance, in Photoshop or Illustrator, we organize our layers and clean up all of the artboards. All the red lines will be on one layer, all the colors on one layer, the designs will be on a layer, and the background will have its own layer. Also, we have to reorder, sometimes we have to reorder the artboards, so we'll rename the artboard so that it's in the correct order. I know it doesn't seem like much, but if you are working with another designer who works completely different than you, it can be a headache. So trying to get the same way, work the same way, it helps a lot.
Okay. And here, I mean, and literally, really, it was all of the assets. It wasn't just like Photoshop files or Illustrator files, but the coded components too were kept in an organized set so that if someone was coming to it, they could quickly and easily see. If I'm just grabbing your set of CSS and JavaScript files and doing these like the set HTML markup, I'm going to get the same checkbox as you've laid out. I'm going to get the same button as you've laid out. And like we had the main guide, which explained the reasoning and purpose behind everything. Alongside it, we also made more of a set. Okay, if you're a developer and you're just trying to get out something very quickly and you need to see what everything works like, we had a page that explained all of that, showed kind of everything just in one big list. That didn't explain the reasoning, hopefully push people back to look to the guide to understand why it was laid out that way, but would give them a very quick view of what they needed to, what they were looking for. And this is just showing off some of that process. Like we ended up using GitHub, and this was actually very enlightening just in the sense, so GitHub is primarily targeted towards developers, but this actually became a very great place to work for everyone in the team. On the right, you can see the Zen Hub add-on, and that was like a Kanban task tracking system. So our researchers were in there, our content writers were in there. Deidre, who was our content writer in California, like she would actually, we didn't have to go to her and say, hey, I wrote this, what is your input on it? A few days later, she'd give us something back. She could actually change the code itself because she had access to it through GitHub. And kind of like the previous talk he was mentioning, a lot of the tools he was stating we used for the final guide, like Sass instead of CSS to keep track of variables, nunjucks for templates. Nunjucks, I believe, is like Jekyll, Gulp, so that when we were coding anything, it automatically updated within our prototypes. And that was really nice just in the sense that by doing things like that, by using Sass to keep track of a variable list of all our colors, we could start to do that iterative process even within the final guide. So everything you saw, like any of those components, wrong one. Yeah, any of the components that we saw on that development page, all the colors were laid out through the Sass file, so that if we later on were like, okay, we really liked magenta and teal, and that's what came out of that earlier study of color, what if it was orange and green? What if it was various things? Through the Sass file, we're able to change 2 variables and then see the entire guide update from that nice organized set of code leading into everything else. And this is something, this was like the last thing I worked on before I left the team. So we got the components, we got the molecules, we got the templates, we got things more complex. Those were very nice because even if you were working on something like this, I was working on, it was an upgrade of SPSS, and it's a complex, it was a bar graph that had a whole bunch of interactions going on and numbers, but it still was following the look and theme. I knew what font choices to make, I knew what color choices to make. I could look towards buttons to think, okay, if these bars have a hover effect, they should mimic that same sort of interaction as our buttons are doing, even if it is a totally different sort of interaction pattern. So we could use that previous set of components to think through more complex patterns. Yeah.
Okay, so our team 2 years ago started off brand new. For most of us, it was our first day on the job. Not Michael, though. He's been there.
I was there 2 years.
2 years,
before,
yeah. But here are some lessons learned from our team to you guys during this process. Lesson 1 comes from Allison Joseph, who is our lead front-end developer. She says, close collaboration between the disciplines will ensure better results. So explain your thought process to each other, and people don't always see things the same way you do. It just makes it a better work experience when you build a relationship with the people that you're actually working with. Lesson 2 comes from Andrew Smith, who is our lead visual designer, and he says, design for the experience, not for the interaction or component. You can design pedals or a seat for a bike, but what you really need to be designing for is that wheelie through the canyon. Design for that experience. Don't design just a component. Lesson 3 comes from Ruben Fernandez, who is our UX and visual designer. He says, always consider the worst case scenarios. When you think you've laid it out as detailed as possible, consider the worst case scenario. You're not going to know how people are going to use this product. It's better to just think, 3 or 4 steps ahead of what's going to be out there. For instance, Ruben designed these cards, and he did a really great job of laying out the typography. But there was this smallest detail of having a really long name, like my own, that would break his card. So he had to go back and consider that while he was designing. Lesson 4 comes from Jennifer Kang, who is a UX and visual designer. She said, it's okay to explore outside of the box, our guide, and to take risks.
Yeah, that was a really big thing here. Like everything we laid out in the guide was just a guide. The developers could just grab the components and work from there and try to make it exactly duplicate it. But we really wanted people to go, I want to have a different, for whatever reason, rounded corners are going to be what makes this product specifically work. They were allowed to do that as long as they had a good reason, as long as it wasn't just completely random. But we really wanted people to take what we were doing and flow with it and mold with it and potentially come back with us with entirely new things that we would then incorporate into the guide at a later date. Oh. And this is my quote, until you see something live, you don't really understand it. So my role is a UX designer, but I know enough code that, the guide that you saw, me and Allison made most of it. But it's one of those, I'm a big fan of the idea that even if you're just working through a basic component, throw it up in CodePen, see what you can do with it, see how it interacts when you actually have it on a device. You're not going to understand all the potential problems you might have with it, along with you're also going to start to see, did you lay out something that it is really cool, it's aesthetically pleasing, but it's going to make your developers' lives hell. And if you did it slightly differently, they would be happier with you. It's almost exactly the same experience, and everything works better that way.
Lesson 6 comes from Deirdre Longo, who is our senior content strategist. And she says, working on the style guide is a great way to affect all interfaces, even those you don't have staff to affect directly.
Yeah. With this one, we tried to keep track. Specifically, it was the teams in Austin who are using the guide, but the Analytics platform covers a whole bunch of different teams across the world, and we didn't even realize it, but there was a few teams that started using it, and before we knew it, there was applications that looked like our guide that we had just lost track of, and they were mimicking us in a good way. Even that list I showed of the other teams who had guides out there, many of them used our guide as a basis and then developed from there to create something that looked like ours but was specific to their team.
Yeah. And finally, I have a quote that says, a style guide is organic and it's meant to be broken, and that's okay. We expect our guide to be broken. It happens all the time. And this is what makes our guide better. And I didn't know a lot of things coming into software for the first time, and I learned a lot along the way, but we adapted to the situations. And if one thing was wrong, we tried to make it as right as we could have. For example, one time I was designing grids, and we had this 12-column grids with margins, and I already put it out on the guide, but there was someone who wanted to flush their designs all the way out to the ends, and that broke my grid pretty much, so I had to go back and consider that situation. So we should never fear making mistakes. Making mistakes is a good thing. Thank you for your time. Here is where you can email us, or you can come up to us and talk to us. And also,
we have to.
We're looking for designers at IBM.